It will then be the time to examine the new interpretation of the Constitution by the present court, Juliet versus Greenman, and ask after the defenses of the people against the revolution with which they are threatened by that court. I'm Bruce G. McCarthy, if you're joining us at this point. Today's message is entitled Economic Myths and the Science of Deceit, Part 11. And we had just finished reading the introduction to a plea for the Constitution, originally written by George Bancroft back in 1886, as published by Harper. Mine is a 1982 Spencer Judd reprint of that book. It's wonderful that there are people out there who have the perspicacity to know what ought to be reprinted. Having finished that introduction, I would like to give you just a summation from George Bancroft's chapters as to what each chapter would be about. Now, those of you who are regular listeners to Datum Line know that we have covered much of this in previous broadcasts quite some time ago. Part 1, which would be Chapter 1 of 5 parts or 5 chapters, according to George Bancroft, his little summation at the top of the page for Part 1 says what the chapter is about. And here's what it is. From the first issue of bills of public credit in the American colonies to their abolition, get that? Their abolition by Connecticut from 1690 to 1755 and 56. See, those notes that people praise oftentimes in popular circles where they talk about the unrivaled prosperity that occurred in Massachusetts because of the notes they issued in 1690 or 92 or thereabouts. In fact, they reissued notes over and over. There was not unrivaled prosperity, I'm sorry. You follow the history of those notes lasted for about 50 years, and prosperity they did not bring. There may have been some prosperity right up front in the first couple of years, but they brought doom and gloom. Anyway, I'll take a look at Part 2, or Chapter 2, and again, Bancroft's summary. This is from page 21. Quote, paper money in America from the beginnings of the 7 Years' War to the Constitutional Convention of the United States from 1755 and 56 to May of 1787. And we covered that chapter as well in a previous broadcast. Here's the chapter that many people seem to ignore, or maybe just simply never knew. This is Part 3, or Chapter 3, found at page 37. The summation by Bancroft. The Federal Convention, this being the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, 1787, shuts and bars the doors against paper money from 14th May to 17th September, 1787. Okay? And again, I say we covered that in the previous message. Part 4, or Chapter 4, deals with, according to Bancroft, the Constitution in the House of its guardians. Who were the guardians? The United States Supreme Court. And in our previous broadcast last week, we got into this chapter, and we were pointing out the various court decisions and Supreme Court justices who uttered their decisions on behalf of the Constitution, limiting the powers of Congress and showing that Congress was not sovereign, that Congress did not have inherent powers, that all powers came from the Constitution, that the Constitution was authored by we the people, and that we could only delegate to Congress those powers that we had. And as I have pointed out, God never gave us the power to steal. You will not find that in the Bible. Okay, so if we don't have the power to steal, nor does Congress, well, what does stealing have to do with bills of credit? Well, the purpose of bills of credit, if they're honest ones, is to get what you produce now and pay you later. If they're dishonest ones, the purpose of legal tender bills of credit is to get what you produce and pay you never. That's the system that has been enshrined to a fixture in America. And the Juliet versus Greenman decision helped to pave the way for that and the Federal Reserve System. Well, we'll now turn to page 60 of Bancroft's book, and we're going to pick up with the next Supreme Court Chief Justice, Salmon P. Chase, who follows Roger B. Taney. Now, Roger B. Taney was the successor to Justice Marshall. Now, all of these justices prior to Salmon P. Chase have upheld the doctrine that Congress or the federal government does not have inherent sovereign powers, that it is a government which was established by a constitution which delegates specific powers, and if the power isn't there, they don't have it. So let's go on here at page 60. Quote, the next Chief Justice, Salmon P. Chase, in the December term, 1869, delivered this opinion of the court. Quote, the Constitution is the fundamental law of the United States. By it, the people have created a government, defined its powers, prescribed their limits, distributed them among the different departments, and directed, in general, the manner of their exercise. No department of the government has any other powers than those thus delegated to it by the people. All the legislative power granted by the Constitution belongs to Congress, but it has no legislative power which is not thus granted. And the same observation is equally true in its application to the executive and judicial powers granted respectively to the President and the courts. All these powers differ in kind, but not in source or in limitation. They all arise from the Constitution and are limited by its terms. End quote. 8 Wallace, page 611. Economic Myths and the Science of Deceit, Part 11. We're in George Bancroft's book, A Plea for the Constitution, originally written back in 1886, or published in 1886 by Harper's. And it was his rebuttal, he being the George Bancroft, a very well-known historian of his day. It was his historical rebuttal, to the Juliet versus Greenman decision, which was fraught with historical errors. And we had mentioned Salmon P. Chase, who had become the next Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court following Roger B. Taney, and Taney had followed Chief Justice Marshall. And all of these court justices, all the way back to the original Supreme Court, which was composed of appointees by President George Washington, had all upheld the doctrine that the Constitution was a document. I'm talking about the United States Constitution, not a state constitution, but the United States Constitution is a document of enumerated and limited powers. If the power is not delegated to a branch of government, that branch of government does not have it. And that was for over 100 years the judicial interpretation by the Supreme Court, and it was the legislative history of Congress that was manifest in accordance with the keeping of that restriction or disability, if you will. Now, on page 61 in Bancroft's book, we're going to pick up with the death of Salmon P. Chase, and we're going to see if the court can find anybody to replace him. Quote, since the death of Chase, that'd be Salmon Portland Chase, the court has had occasion to express once more its opinion on this subject. What subject? The subject of sovereign power. This is brought up by the fact that we have so many populists who believe that Congress has sovereign power, exclusive power, the authority, if you will, to emit bills of credit, create what they call paper money, because there's no such thing as paper money. Paper's never been used as money in history. It's too heavy to be used as money. My argument is, how much paper would it take to buy a new SUV? Okay, you go figure that one out. Anyway, in the October term of 1882, when it was, when the Supreme Court was composed identically, man for man, of the very same 9 men that constitute it now. When's now? 1884, in the Juliet versus Greenman decision that we've been talking about. It, the Supreme Court, referred to the opinion of Marshall. Who's he? Chief Justice, who preceded Chase and preceded Taney, which I have cited, and adopted it. So the U.S. Supreme Court, that was composed of the same justices as in Juliet, adopted it without reserve as its own. Well, what was that decision? For itself, it added concisely and excellently well, quote, and this is what they said: the government of the United States is one of delegated, limited, and enumerated powers. Therefore, Every valid act of Congress must find in the Constitution some warrant for its passage, end quote. This taken from 106 United States Report, page 635, 636. Here's now Bancroft. The opinion of the court of March 3rd, 1884, this is Juilliard, in the case of Juilliard versus Greenman, is therefore in flagrant antagonism to the Constitution of the United States and to the repeated, continuous, and unanimously given and justly respected interpretations of the Constitution by the court itself under a succession of chiefs without a break. I'll turn to page 62. We'll pick up with this statement. On the death of Chase, Salmon P. Chase, it is of my knowledge that the President Grant, desired to place upon the bench as his successor a member of his cabinet, Hamilton Fish, in whom he is known to have reposed the greatest trust. That statesman has the character of fidelity to his convictions of constitutional truth, and his friends know well that on the question which is now under consideration, the words which follow have ever formed his opinion. Quote, the Constitution of the United States gives to the general government the powers of a sovereign nation in its condition as one among the family of nations, but then only in its dealings and relations with foreign governments. In its internal relations and in its dealings with the several states of the Union and with its own citizens, the government of the United States is one of delegated and enumerated powers, forbidden the exercise of very many, and among them of some of the most important and frequently exercised powers of sovereignty. In their internal relations, albeit supreme within its prescribed sphere of action, the government of the United States is far, very far removed from the powers of a sovereign state. The legal tender legislation of Congress is of purely internal and domestic force and operation. It ceases to be operative precisely when the sovereign powers of the government begin, and can rightfully invoke no sanction or authority from those powers of sovereignty. Wow. Further, says Bancroft, while the seat of the Chief Justice of the United States remained vacant, Roscoe Conkling of New York was requested and urged, though in vain, by President Grant, to accept this position. Okay, Roscoe Conkling, his opinion on the point of constitutional law, which is now under discussion, was pronounced in public before he was first designated for the high office of Chief Justice, and has never changed. It runs thus, quote, the Constitution of the United States is an instrument of delegated and enumerated powers, and Congress has no powers except those which the Constitution confers. In looking for a power in the Constitution of a state, the question usually is, has it been taken away or forbidden? But in looking at the federal Constitution, the question is, has the power been given? If it is not there, there is an end of the matter. That's taken from the Congressional Globe at Part 1, second session. That'd be the 37th session of Congress, 1861 to 1862 at page 635. Bancroft goes on. It is well known to the winter residents of Washington, that'd be on the Potomac there, that in the early part of 1882, the executive of that day desired to place on the Supreme Bench George F. Edmunds, then and now a senator from Vermont. And his wish, supported by the very strong and very general concurrence of opinion, was defeated only by the refusal of the senator himself. But on the question which we are discussing, this is interesting, that George Bancroft not only took the various Supreme Court decisions of the past for about 100 years and showed they were consistently showing that Congress didn't have this supreme power that Mr. Thorne, Mr. Warner, and others of the populist persuasion say that they have, but he even takes a look at the Supreme Court justices who were to be appointed who refused, and what their position was as judges